Chapter 15. In the morning the sun rose, and the cricket song gave way to bird song. And an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. "Humph!" she said. She pushed at Edward with her fishing rod. "Looks like a rabbit," she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. "Only he ain't real." She stood back up. "Humph!" she said again. She rubbed her back. "What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say." Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he felt the night before had gone away and had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. "Pick me up or don't pick me up," the rabbit thought. "It makes no difference to me." The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish. And then she kept walking, swinging the basket and singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I've seen." Edward, in spite of himself, listened. "I've seen troubles too," he thought. "You bet I have, and apparently they aren't over yet." Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a post in her vegetable garden. She nailed his ears to the wooden post and spread his arms out as if he were flying, and attached his paws to the post by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie tins hung from the post. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. "Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare them off," the old lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving in his ears. "Go on, Clyde," said the woman. She clapped her hand. "You gotta act ferocious." Clyde? Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sigh aloud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. "Get to work, Clyde," she said. "Scare them birds off." And then she walked away from him, out of the garden and towards her small house. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads in his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the post and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. "Caw, caw, caw," without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. "Go ahead," he thought. "Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I am done with caring." "Caw, caw," said the Pellegrina crow. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars, but for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. "You are down there alone," the stars seemed to say to him, "and we are up here in our constellations together." "I have been loved," Edward told the stars. "So?" said the stars. "What difference does that make when you are all alone now?" Edward could not think of no answer to that question. Eventually, the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. "Bryce," said the old woman, "get away from that rabbit. I ain't paying you to stand and stare." "Yes, ma'am," said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and continued to look up at Edward. The boy's eyes were brown, with flecks of gold shining in them. "Hey," he whispered to Edward. A crow settled on Edward's head and the boy flapped his arms and shouted, "Go on, get!" And the bird spread its wings and flew away. "Bryce!" shouted the old woman. "Ma'am," said Bryce, "get away from that rabbit. Do your work. I ain't gonna say it again." "Yes'm," said Bryce. He wiped his hand across his nose. "I'll be back to get you," he said to Edward. The rabbit spent the day hanging by his ears, baking in the hot sun, watching the old woman and Bryce weed and hoe the garden. Whenever the woman wasn't looking, Bryce raised his hand and waved. The bird circled over Edward's head, laughing at him. What was it like to have wings? Edward wondered. If he had wings when he was tossed overboard, he would not have sunk to the bottom of the sea. Instead, he would have flown in the opposite direction up into the deep, bright blue sky, and when Lolly took him to the dump, he would have flown out of the rubbish and followed her and landed on her head, holding on with his sharp claws. And on the train, when the man kicked him, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, he would have risen up and sat on top of the train and laughed at the man. "Caw, caw, caw." In the late afternoon, Bryce and the old lady left the garden. Bryce winked at Edward as he walked past him. One of the crows lighted on Edward's shoulder and tapped with its beak at Edward's china face, reminding the rabbit with each tap that he had no wings, that not only could he not fly, he could not move on his own at all in any way. Dusk descended over the garden, and then came true dark. A whip-poor-will sang. A whip-poor-will sang out over and over again. Whip-poor-will, whip-poor-will. It was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard, and then came another song, the hum of a harmonica. Bryce stepped out of the shadows. "Hey," he said to Edward. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and then played another bit of the song on the harmonica. "I bet you didn't think I'd come back, but here I am. I come to save you." Too late, thought Edward, as Bryce climbed the post and worked at the wires that tied around his wrists. "I am nothing but a hollow rabbit." Too late, thought Edward, as Bryce pulled the nails out of his ears. "I am only a doll made of china." But when the last nail was out and he fell forward into Bryce's arms, the rabbit felt a rush of relief, and the feeling of relief was followed by one of joy. Perhaps, he thought, it is not too late, after all, for me to be saved.